So this is the second panel, Water Supply Reliability and Its Challenges, and we're very fortunate to have the A team to talk about this to the panel. The presenters will be John Lehigh from Department of Water Resources, who's going to cover water operations supply. And then Dan Kyan from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography will be talking to you about climate change. And then Franz Spivey-Weber from the State Water Resources Control Board is going to talk a little about the regulatory environment. And then Dr. Howard from UC Davis will be back to talk about the water supply economics. And we're going to wrap up this session with Joe Grindstaff from the Inland Empire Utilities District. And of course, Joe served with great distinction as being the founding executive officer of the Delta Stewardship Council. So we're delighted to have this panel here this morning. So the first speaker will be John Lehigh, and John, if you're going to sit there or if you want to stand up at the podium, it's your choice.
Again, my name is John Lehigh, Principal Water Manager for Department of Water Resources, State Water Project, Water Operations. And I want to thank you for the invitation, and I appreciate the opportunity to give my perspective on these issues related to the challenges. And so my perspective as water manager for the State Water Project is, so my responsibilities are essentially for the more shorter term annual decisions on allocations for the State Water Project. So essentially assessing that snow survey information that gets reduced down to runoff forecasts for the year, and put that in combination with our Delta conveyance opportunities that we're looking at for the current year, and marry that with the demand patterns from our customers, ag users in the Central Valley and urban users in the LA Basin. In addition to that kind of seasonal or annual look, there's the kind of the real-time, day-to-day water management decisions that are being made as part of the coordinated operations between the State Water Project and the federal Central Valley Project. So, this includes all the decisions that are made as far as timing of releases from the reservoirs, Shasta, Oroville, Folsom, on a real-time basis, and meeting various Delta outflow standards in the Delta, meeting the salinity standards. So this is the coordination of those releases from upstream and the exports from the South Delta. So one challenge is to get the next slide going. Okay, so a challenge is trying to summarize what our challenges are in 8 minutes, I suppose. But I've narrowed it down to 3 topics here, as you can see. So I'm going to touch on the hydrologic uncertainty, the regulatory uncertainty, and operational flexibility. And hopefully, in some respects, this may set the stage for some of the following speakers as well. So before we look at any of the factors related to climate change, related to the ecosystem collapse in some ways, we really have to look at the foundational uncertainty that's inherent in our water management system, which is the variability of the hydrology. And state of California is unique in its variability throughout the United States. You know, we're dependent on just a handful of storms from year to year that produce the majority of our water supply. You know, so for example, this year is a great example. We've received about 90% of our precipitation in the last 3 months in probably just 3 days. It occurred in early February. So it's really hit or miss on that supply. It's fits and starts as far as it presents, of course, a real challenge in managing that supply. And to add to that, really, if you look at the storage capabilities and the carryover storage capabilities of the two projects as it relates to the average annual runoff, it really pales in comparison to that snowpack we are highly dependent upon on a year-to-year basis as far as that supply that we're expected to see. So we have very little help from prior years as far as the water supply coming into the next year. And so in some sense, we're almost a run-of-the-river type operation as far as managing the system. As far as it relates to hydrology, the other big point on uncertainty is the regulatory uncertainty. And there's kind of two aspects to this. Over time, regulation as it relates to our water rights obligations and compliance with ESA, we have had layer upon layer of regulatory rules in place that govern the operations of both the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. You know, you can go back to the original water rights decision, 1485, 1978. That COA is the Coordinated Operations Agreement, which essentially is a default settlement agreement between the two projects on how we meet those responsibilities that are in D 1485 and beyond. CVPIA, which came online early 90s, reallocated 800,000 acre-feet of the Central Valley Project supplies to the environment. You know, as we continue to gain more knowledge as far as what the needs are for the ecosystem for the Delta, we've had more layers included in D 1641, which included, for example, the Spring X2 EI ratio, export to inflow ratio that we operate to. And most recently, because of the pelagic organism decline and new listed species as far as steelhead, spring run, we've had 2 new biological opinions in the late 2008, 2009. And that has further restricted projects' capability of, or it's increased the conflict between being able to capture supplies in the winter and spring when the majority of the flows are occurring and when they're those periods most sensitive to the fishery. And then what's to come next? Currently, Water Quality Control Plan periodic review is in place. So we've gone from a period of, I'd say, kind of demand limited. We'd often hit 100% of our requests for the State Water Project as we went through the 70s and 80s. So a combination of factors with the demands increasing on the project, the other senior water rights holders, other area of origin water users in the Sacramento Valley have increased their demands. In addition, we've had new constraints on the export capabilities. So the combination of those facts have really put us in a position of a chronic shortage as far as both the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project are concerned. So, a combination of all these factors coming together has kind of put us where we are today. A little bit then also on, as it relates to the regulatory uncertainty, there's another aspect of this, and this is the annual implementation of some of these new regulations. Whereas some of the water rights requirements under from the state board, D 1485, D 1641, they're very prescriptive in terms of based on water year, based on hydrology, sets a certain outflow requirement, sets a certain salinity requirement, whereas some of the new regulatory rules associated with the biological opinions are much more real-time management focused. So they're highly dependent upon ecological parameters such as distribution of the fishery, distribution of turbidity is now the kind of the new issue of de jure, and decisions are made more on a real-time basis, and those regulatory restrictions will vary significantly on a day-to-day basis, and it's a very cumbersome process between both the two project operators and the fishery agencies in order to establish what those operating rules will be. So it's kind of a two-edged sword. It's an effort to not necessarily take a prescriptive step regardless of the real time, but at the same time, it's a very resource-intensive effort in order to try to maximize the supply that we can while still providing sufficient protections for the fishery. So this is to be an example, my final slide, but this is an example of kind of our outlook going into a water year. So this would be done in, say, the fall prior to the coming year. This is a generic example. It's not one for this year. But these are the kinds of variability we're looking at depending on what kind of precipitation we get for the coming year. Can be all over the board, all over the map, as I had indicated, dry to wet. So that will have a big, of course, a big factor in what our final allocation would be for the project. But there's this additional parameter now, which is the regulatory variability, and that is what I just described as far as this kind of real-time management. And we won't know ahead of time what that distribution is going to look like for the fishery or the other ecological parameters. But that introduces a new degree of variation as far as what the final delivery capabilities of the projects are. So I guess that kind of summarizes, I guess, the two high points as far as the challenges that we see as far as project operations and how we can deliver that supply. How that reliability has been decreasing over time. So I guess I'll leave it at that for now, and look forward to questions later.
Well, thanks, John. And just for the presenters, what we're doing is just asking the panel if they have any clarifying questions, and then depth discussion of these. So, members, do you have any clarifying questions for John? Thanks, John. Well, the second presenter this morning is then the Diana Clayton. Please talk to us about climate change.
Pleasure to be here. Good morning. Interesting discussion. Thanks for the setup, John. I guess my message is that we have to have an advancing phenomena, climate change, that's going to affect really processes across the board, variety of ways. But, of course, that's going to be overlain by this natural variability that John just mentioned, which in some cases makes these problems perhaps not so bad, and in some cases it gets much more acute. So this is a time series of annual precipitation from the Sierran region, and really John kind of set this up. And one thing I guess I'd like to mention is, of course, as we're seeing in this present spell, this isn't just a 1 year wet, next year dry phenomena all the time. It's marked by these low frequency fluctuations, and another view of this pretty much the same series there at the top with the bars where we've smoothed it. My colleague Mike Dettinger produced this as well as a couple of the graphics that John showed. So we have these multi-year swings which really characterize administrations and lead scientists, tenures, and so forth, operators. We're in a really dry one right now, but an interesting thing, much the same message as John showed, is that these multi-year swings, and in fact the interannual variations, are driven exquisitely strongly by a handful of storms. The 5% highest events are the ones shown here in this red trace, and those are dominating interannual to decadal variability. Those are the presence or absence of those really large storms really drive our water supply here in California. And of course, they are also the flood generators, so they're sort of a double-edged sword. Looking to the future, of course, we're in an unprecedented era in Earth's history where temperatures are rising over the last few decades as greenhouse gases have accumulated in the atmosphere, and those greenhouse gas accumulations, depending on which emissions pathway globally we ride upon, have really profound implications on where we go in the future. This dashed line here is plus 2 degrees Celsius over today's levels for summertime in California. 2 degrees C has been labeled as dangerous by a number of pundits in the scientific community for a variety of reasons. And what you see here is that by, charitably by mid-century, just about every global climate model scenario starts to flirt with that plus 2 Celsius in the summertime. And of course, it goes beyond that, particularly if we're participating in this higher emissions scenario. So the emissions pathways really begin to matter beyond about mid-century. It's kind of like accumulating credit card debt. So the more flagrant we are, the more our ancestors our progeny are going to have to deal with. I guess another thing is that summer times become warmer in the interior than winter, and as I mentioned, this natural variation is a big part of the story, even as we get on into the future. Sea level rise, of course, has been mentioned. We're projected a middle level of sea level rise now is somewhere in the 1 meter over recent historical levels, and that is an acceleration over what we've seen historically. Historically, we've been accustomed to about half of a foot in a century, and the new rates are really going to eclipse this if projections are correct. And then, of course, as those rates rise, the events, exceedances over some threshold, you can think of that as water overtopping a seawall or a levee, or you can think of that as X2. Those become more and more frequent, and in fact, quite commonplace, depending on what threshold you use in the future. So those events become more frequent, more durable, and more intense. Our snowpack, of course, is going to suffer as climate warms. We've seen 2 winters now where precipitation has been low and snow has been extraordinarily low because of the warming that we've had in these last couple of winters. I don't mean to attribute that entirely to climate change. I'm just saying it's an analog. But as we look into the future, we will see by as the century wears on, early, middle, latter part of the century, the color scale is a fraction of today's snow that is left. And by the time you get to these red shades, you're 30% or less than today. In bulk, a relatively kind model simulation with not so much warming loses about a third of the snowpack by mid-century, and by end of century, probably a little in excess of half of today's snowpack in the springtime. That doesn't mean we've lost water. It does mean, however, that water becomes more of a challenge to manage. Upstream, not only there's water, but there's other phenomena going on, such as wildfires, and it's important to know that over the period since the mid-'80s, when we've had a spate of warm springs and summers, we've seen a 4-fold increase over the west in large wildfires, a 6-fold increase roughly in the amount of acres burned, and those events have happened where springs have come early. So less snowpack, earlier drying of forest fuels, and lots more vulnerability to wildfires. So I guess to boil this down, we anticipate warmer conditions, so that would be air and water in the Delta. Very likely we would see larger floods as snow lines in storms are elevated, and there's more runoff for a given watershed. Drought is probably a phenomena, of course, that will continue. Our variability in the system is going to persist, but it will occur in an increasingly warm climate. Sea level rise will sort of exacerbate things from the oceanic side. Probably we'll have less stored water, certainly in the form of snowpack, and possibly in our reservoirs, since reservoirs are used for dual purposes, not only water storage, but flood protection. And I guess I'd like to mention that these changes, at least the way we face them, are not going to be gradual. They will probably be very episodic. and they will be episodic because we have this enormous natural variability that compounds things in certain cases, so that it's not something that we can afford to wait till 2050. We really have to confront this because it could happen next year.
Any clarifying questions, panel members? Thanks very much. Next presenter will be Fran Spivey Weber, who serves as the Vice Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. And Fran, we really appreciate it. You've got an awful lot of things on your plate right now, so thanks for being here.
We are here about the Salton Sea, aren't we? Where am I? Thank you. I do not have a PowerPoint, so I will hope that will help me keep on pace. I'll cut to the chase. The main points that I want to end with, and I will end with, are that we definitely have data out there among our various agencies, in the universities, in various and sundry places. But it's not organized very well. It's not easily accessible. And it's something that we really do need to get a grip on. Because as we've heard from John and from Dan, we're going to need to be able to act flexibly. We're going to need, we're uncertain about so many things, and we're going to need to have data and models, I'll add models as well, to help devise the scenarios for making decisions. And so I think that is something that if you take it on, that's wonderful. If you want to help us figure out how to take it on, I also think that's good. A third area that I will reemphasize again at the end is technology. I think there's a lot of technology that's out there that is being developed for being smarter, being more real-time. These technologies don't necessarily have to reside inside the government. They can reside in other places, but we need access to them. We need to be using the smart technologies of the future. Now, what are those and which ones? Do we need to be doing more with aerial photography? Do we need to be doing more with metering and smart meters? Do we need, I don't even know all the things that are out there right now, but I do know we need to be on top of this. And it's very difficult sometimes for government agencies individually to get the funding to step up, but also to be able to know exactly what to do. So I think this is a role that you all can play. As most of you know, the State Water Resources Control Board has a number of regulatory authorities. We are regulatory authority for water rights, for water quality, now for drinking water. But we also have funding, and almost every agency does have some kind of funding, whether it be bond funding or whether it be revolving loan funds for us for drinking water or for clean water. And I think, again, the idea of coordinating with the federal government, with the state government, at the local level, which is where most of the funding resides, you need to be looking at the agencies as to what kind of assets they can bring to the table, but no single agency is going to have all the assets, nor should we want that. There have been a lot of changes over the last 25 years, and some of them just in the last year or two. Among the changes are the fact that we're now talking quite seriously about climate and climate change. We're seeing changes, while they may not be 100% climate derived. A lot of the predictions from the climate scientists are we're seeing them, and so we're putting, I think, increasing faith in what's happening in the science. And none of it says we're going back to the past. So, how good are we at forecasting with uncertainty into the future? we're not very good. We don't have that capability. We tend to use the past as our guide, both for regulations as well as for management. And so we need to be able to move forward in this area of forecasting. We now have groundwater legislation. It's going to take a while to get it all completely sorted out, but the big piece in terms of groundwater has been added to the overall management of California's water resources. I think that's going to be positive, but it's not something that you had or that was there when the Delta Plan was first put together, and I think that needs to be addressed. We have a lot more integrated regional management of resources, a wide portfolio of resources in most areas, particularly in most urban areas. You have recycled water, stormwater capture, desalination in some areas. The area for gray water is growing. Lots and lots of conservation, and we've gotten into calling for conservation regulations, and in fact, that's something we'll be dealing with tomorrow in terms of an emergency. And there are greater opportunities now for improved operations, again, from a lot of the SMART efforts. So in terms of my request to this science team, look at not where we've been, but where we need to be going, and helping us put into place the technologies, the models, the data organizing. Maybe there's new data needed, but if the data is there somewhere, we should be able to have it organized so that people can get access to it and use it as they need, and forecasting. Those are my 4 requests. Thank you.
Thank you. And clarifying questions from the panel?
Okay. Thanks, everybody. It's good to be back up here. It's kind of depressing listening to the first 2 talks. It's kind of like, wow, I'd forgotten how depressing this could be. But I'm going to move on quickly. I think there we go. First thing I pulled out was from a newspaper article last year from Australia. And I thought it was very interesting that it said in this article that they had a 12-year drought. They finally got serious in year 9, which reminds me of us. It reminds me of me, to be honest. It reminds me of how we do things. And their number one thing they would have done is they would have saved more water much sooner. So that speaks to conservation. And then the last thing I think is absolutely critical as well, unite the public behind conservation and water policy reforms. So to me, those are the really big things. The picture of Australia there actually has some highlights of what they think climate change impacts would be, and we could probably put the same kind of graphic up about California. I think we have lots and lots of things in common, but that fundamental message about conservation, conserving water, saving it for the future is really important. And I don't think we always realize it. The 2 graphics at the bottom here, the one on the left is temperatures, and the one on the right is the Palmer Drought Index. And the cost of conservation, it's actually the least cost supply, but it has a huge impact on agencies that are actually implementing it. So that's one of the big challenges as we move ahead. So that's a huge issue. A second huge issue was foreshadowed in that quote from Australia, because you really have to have the public behind you. you have to have the public agree. We have to change our water use as we move ahead. That's a fundamental thing. If you can achieve the financial objectives and then incentivize conservation and get the public to agree, okay, our way of use needs to change, then we can make major changes as we move ahead. I do want to point out that it's really, really critical that we have good data. We do not have great data throughout the state. I live and work in the Santa Ana watershed, probably one of the most advanced in the state. With it's an urban area. We have been working together for a long, long time, done many, many things, but we don't have as much data as we really need to do. So just recently we've agreed we're all going to actually gather more specific data on exactly how much landscape we have in the area and try and estimate what the real needs are for water supply as we move ahead. And our objective, there actually is legislation in the state that says there are kind of standards or de facto standards for water use. One is indoor use is 55 gallons per person per day. That's there's actually a law that says that's an appropriate usage. I'm proud to say our agency meets that. So we've got almost 1 million people in San Bernardino County that do that. And I think actually most of the state probably is getting close. Where we really fall down is on the landscape irrigation, because we don't honestly truly meet the standards of optimizing water use for landscaping. I think when you think about moving forward, I try and compare water conservation with changing our attitudes about smoking or seat belts, and those required both regulatory things, Fran, so I got her sitting on one side, and economic things I think are necessary on water and that, and also the public. Somehow we have to get the public committed to make changes, and if we do that, I'm convinced we can get where we need to be. Conservation. This graphic is from one of our member agencies in the Santa Ana watershed that implemented the allocation-based rate structure, which is where they actually said, here's what our objectives are, here's how much water you should be using. If you use more than what is allocated for your size property, your type of use, then we're going to charge you a lot more. And you can see where their demands, their per capita demands, have significantly decreased, and the last little decrease there was actually when they implemented the state standards and said those are the standards we're going to use. Before that, they actually had higher standards. So I think that's an important thing as we move ahead. I wanted that last bullet down there on the bottom because in Australia, it became kind of a badge of honor that they were going to really use water wisely. I don't think it's that way in California yet, but that is if we are truly going to make conservation a way of life, which is, I think, how the governor's Water Action Plan started, is we're going to make conservation a way of life, then we have to do that. We have to get the public to accept that. So with that, any questions, any clarifying points?
Thank you, Joe, for being so clear. Like, no questions from the panel? Thanks, Joe, for always giving such an optimistic message of a tough problem. Our last formal presentation will be by Dr. Howard, who's going to talk a little about the water supply economics.
Thank you, Peter. Interesting thing happened a year ago, February the 14th, 2014. The bids from the Buena Vista Water District offer on water were published, and water became a commodity. Why do I say this? In 2009 drought, the highest price paid for water in the San Joaquin Valley was around $550 an acre foot. In last February, Buena Vista had 12,000 acre feet up for sale, and they were going to sell it to the highest bidder, provided they were agriculture and in southern San Joaquin Valley, Tulare Basin. The knowledge was, everyone thought, well, gee, this is probably going to clear for about 650. The bids were oversubscribed 6 times. All water was sold over $1,000 an acre foot. Boom. Price doubled. Concept doubled. And it went from there on up. Basically, what happened is what happened in Australia a long time ago. Water is now a commodity and a really valuable one. The second thing which is interesting on water supply is that the Buena Vista bids were strictly for agriculture and southern San Joaquin agriculture. None of this urban agriculture interface, and yet the prices are in that same range that the urbans find it economical to purchase water from agriculture. So 2 things happened. Prices doubled, and the equilibrium between urban and agricultural water occurred in price-wise. It is a commodity. So what about Delta science? What do we have to know? Well, how does the delta feature economically in water supply? And the answer, the number is $700. Because if you have an acre foot of water above the delta, it's worth about $700 more if it's south of the delta in the canal. Some of that, of course, about 30%, is carriage water requirements for getting across the delta. But the rest of it is due to the regulatory restrictions John pointed out we've got in passing water through the delta in drought years. And so because of those, the delta has become an even more critical hub than it was. And like any energy or information network hub, there are rents to be extracted. And so I was struck in the previous panel where I was, taking the total federal state money for upgrading levees was $12 million a year, right? Let's just have an average export and just put $10 an acre foot export tax from the delta. That's $50 million we're talking about. They said in sooner or later it's real money. And so what we've got to think about is the delta as a conveyance system if we're going to be serious about dual criteria. And I would encourage, therefore, looking at this, tying in with the previous statements that Dan has made and shown about the change in sea level rise and what that means for where that X2 salinity interface is going to be in the river in different times of the year. What that means for diverting water, because not only do you want quantity, you've got quality. Quality currently is measured, of course, in salinity, and salinity is affected by X2. This is an inescapable conclusion from Dan's sea level rise predictions. Secondly, to go back to what Fran said about information, is what the Australians did is they, having turned their water into a commodity with important external impacts on the environment and society, they then set up an ability to trade it. And I actually have on my iPhone an Australian water trading website, and I can tell you what the value of water is on the middle reaches of the Murray-Darling Basin right now. But also, what they set up were environmental zones in which you could move water without significant environmental value. And so you go all the way down the Murray-Darling River, and there's environmental zones defined. And within those environmental zones, you can move water quickly and cheaply. If you step over the boundaries, you have to have more regulatory restrictions. What this does is it lowers the cost of trading the commodity. And a recent paper, I was in New Zealand with a friend at La Trobe University, attributed about $2.5 billion savings to the fact that Australians were able to trade water without significant environmental costs. So I would go back to saying we are now moved into a phase where we have a valuable commodity. The delta is the hub of that commodity, and hubs in gas or electricity always extract a rent for passing through the hub. And frankly, that's where the money to restore the delta and to maintain it is going to come from.
Richard, any clarifying? I'll open it to just generic questions on this topic. What do you need to...
I'll start. I have some questions actually for a number of you, but I'll start with Dan. You provided us some very interesting information on some of the climate projections and looked at some of the consequences of those climate projections. The one that I didn't see in your projections that I'd like to get your thoughts about is that you mentioned the increase in both intensity and acreage burned from forest fires. My understanding is in the western United States, about 4 times that amount of burn is occurring in forest dieback. And forest dieback being brought on by vapor pressure deficits because of the earlier snow melt and the greater pressure on these trees. Do you have some information on how much of California has been affected by forest dieback versus forest fire?
I'm sorry, flips my expertise. Colleagues that I work with, I could take that as a homework assignment back to you, but I don't know. My impression is that see dieback kind of big time in Southern California. Some of the I'm not aware of sale dieback state, but I think that the pests, beetles, so forth, exacerbated.
Of course, that's the mechanism behind forest dieback in most cases.
I know throughout the Southwest there's this issue, but I don't have. Sorry.
One of the ways to organize thinking in ways that, like, for instance, can understand or can use are performance measures. Other places have tried to do performance measures in specific ways. We've got lots of publications about this, but we've never really done this successfully in California. I'd be interested as we go through the questions and as you all think within your various fields of expertise, what are the things that we should be tracking through time? Just 3 or 4 things that we should be tracking through time from the existing information base, from the things we can do right now. What are some of those things that we could track through time so policymakers see what we're doing and if what we're doing is working? And those things don't have to get into all the details of why, but they have to alert us to trends so that we can know where to investigate. But I'd be really interested from your areas of expertise what you think some of these critical things are and if that's a feasible thing to do.
I think it's a great idea, and I know a number of institutions, including the federal, are looking at life stages and looking at performance measures, if you will, on various life stages of salmon and wildlife. So I would put wildlife as one of the. It may not have been what you were thinking about, but I would put that as a performance measure. Water use that Joe was mentioning is another number that we can work with. For there, we have them, we test them. energy use is another one.
Yeah, I want to add on to what Fran said. Water use for each kind, we need to know how much water we use for indoor use. Talk about the earth for that. We need to know how much water we use for landscaping, and further, we ought to know what kind of landscaping we're using it on. Is it an appropriate condition? So if you look at how we're using water now, very often, it's just easier to do that. And even if you increase the price, many parts of Southern California, hard to increase the price enough, the impact daily water use for those kinds of things. But honestly, we don't even have all the numbers we ought to have. So we could then use the standards, established standards, and then discuss that. Even in agriculture, we serve about 10,000 acre-feet of in our area, 3-cycle farm. We've caught some. One of our board members who was a dairyman for his career, and he's talked about should we actually establish standards, agronomic usage rates for different kind of crops in our area, establish more than what amount crops. I don't know the answer, Todd, but I think gathering data is the first step. We can't really decision
responsibility for the project?
Well, I guess the overall bottom line performance measures trend is not good. We know what they are as far as the ecological health of the estuary and also the fulfillment of requested deliveries. So those performance measures are not good on a global sense. I guess thinking about this in terms of improving our tools and our flexibility in dealing with this variability. Certainly, there's probably a number of aspects. Improving our skill level at forecasting, so that would include predictions for water supply runoff for the remainder of the year. Certainly that's an area if we can improve that tightens a bit of that uncertainty. And there's a number of efforts underway as far as linking satellite imagery, that type of thing. As an additional effort on top of the annual snow survey and snow sensor information that's out there. I think another is just the shorter term forecast capabilities, the skill level there. And just anecdotally, just my experience over the last 20 years, I think that skill level has improved immensely. That's a very key element because of the short duration periods in which the water supply occurs, and because of the inherent trade-off between the flood protection aspects and the water supply aspects. So whether or not we can capture an event as it comes in is it's going to be highly dependent upon what those forecasts are for the kind of precipitation that we're going to receive in the developing zone. And so therefore it helps us manage those risks between those two primary objectives, which is water supply and flood management. So those are a couple of areas, I guess, is just tracking kind of that skill level on those forecasting capabilities.
I would add that just having performance measures on their own won't be enough. we can't afford to do everything. And so we really have to think, you will have to think through, what are the key areas that where we do, what's the question we're trying to answer with the data that we want to get in better shape? And then what technologies are there out there, particularly technologies that are less expensive perhaps, that need to be deployed in order to better capture this information. Almost nobody is putting in need without them being smart. Almost in house by house meters, or at least farm by farm meters, at least maybe a thing of the past if you're going to do it on every farm. So we need help in that area on these.
I would just add that we need to know what the value of water is in different places and different, and we need to know its riskiness, going back to what Don said. Essentially, if something is getting more valuable and more risky, we've got to manage it more precisely, substitute information for water. I would certainly not be in favor of telling farmers how much water they should use on crops. I think they're the best judges of that, because if they're paying the correct price for it. So what I would like to see is the role of public outreach for urban conservation. I think it's extraordinarily important what Joe was saying. I think on the agricultural side, I think the role of prices is most effective. And for that, we need an expanded and more fluid and, above all, more public water market.
This is probably to everyone. So as we move from demand limited chronic shortage system, which we're undoubtedly going to be in from now on, we've heard that most of what we need is somehow to capture more water.
Sorry, Johnny, do you think you can get a little closer to the mic?
Still not working? Peter, you're making this difficult. Yeah, I'll get close. So I'll cut to the chase here. So what do you think is going to be the role of both conservation and increasing supply, and what are those, how are those things going to manifest themselves? Are they going to be regulatory, or are they going to be just free market driven? Because we're hearing, I'm hearing, I guess I should say, different things, that we need to regulate people's water use or the cost based on how much they should use, or we should just let the price of water float, and whoever wants to buy it should be able to buy it for whatever cost. I know I'm exaggerating, but I want to see what your response might be. So what do you envision is the plan to move forward with this, undoubtedly within this very constrained system that we have in the future?
I think it's going to be both, so I'll answer. I think you have to set standards in some cases. But the market is clearly what will drive, it's probably the main driving force as we move ahead. But I think you need set standards, especially on the urban side. But even on the ag side, one of the reasons why we're considering it is because there are rules that limit the market. And until those rules get changed, and until you actually have a much broader market, there's a limited amount of buyers. We have laws that constrain how you can sell that water, what the price is going to be. So within that very limited kind of system, having a market doesn't work. There is no effective market. So again, regulation may come into effect. But in the long run, economic behavior, I showed that one graph, pricing, that came from saying, here is your allocation, and you didn't say people couldn't take water. What they did was say your price increases significantly if you take more than you're allotted, and your price increases significantly beyond that And you have to square that with California law because the law is pretty specific about how you can charge people here. You can't charge more than the actual cost of providing that service. And so there are nuances that are pretty important. But I think
also we have such a large number of water agencies, groundwater agencies, surface water agencies, agricultural agencies that are out there, and so just relying on either or the market won't work. You have to set standards, but you need the market to be able to signal out possibly see. But I would add a third area, and that is messaging. I think messaging is where you can target hard cases, if you will. In Southern California, just last week, a water agency approved the use of a smart device and they put it on their 100 worst users. Largest user themselves. And they have started to see drops in those devices now for sending out information. Say, you're using twice as much water as your neighbor. That is proving in using mud and other things. Matching the message with the money with the standards, I think.
Sure. Yes, as far as the on the supply side of it, so certainly, as I was indicating in the last answer, more efficient use of existing storage that relates to kind of this trade-off between flood management purpose and water supply, but also, enhanced use of conjunctive use with groundwater, perhaps infrastructure, new infrastructure as far as it relates to storage. But and part of that is to help with the kind of the upstream part of the equation. But if there's the other part of the equation, of course, is the conveyance through the delta. And in some ways, we've taken having had to take a step backwards as far as our ability to manage the supplies. And this is to a large extent a good portion of the runoff actually occurs downstream of the major dams. Our ability to manage that supply has become increasingly limited because of the conflicts with the fishery and the protections of the fishery. And so we've actually taken a step back in our ability to manage that additional supply. So for a good example is just here we are in the midst of record drought, and we actually had flows well in exceedance of our requirements last month for the storm that came through. Much of the flow was greater than we were responsible for. So that's another piece of this. And as far as the supply on the big picture, project wide, again, to the extent that we can exercise that storage to a greater extent, we can increase the yield. Of course, there's a trade-off between yield and reliability. The more you rely on those storages to gain, increase your annual average supply, you're not going to be as prepared for the dry periods when they occur. So I think another element of that is we really need to improve the reliability aspect more on the local level, more on enhancing the storage capabilities more on the local, regional, so that and the larger supply is not there from the projects, those tools need to be there to deal with these kind of intense shortage periods that we're experiencing currently. So, yeah, I think that's as far as the supply side of the equation.
I've got a bunch, but I'll start with one that's sort of been plaguing me after People's Rules came out, and that is, what exactly does water supply reliability mean? You two will have a different answer, but I'd really be interested to hear your perspective on that.
It's the probability of delivering a quantity and location.
Somehow it's matching demands to supplies. In my mind, that's it. So approach it from both sides, that match.
What I would add to that, because I think we've gotten a fairly good definition, is that in practice, water supply reliability does not necessarily come with conservation. One thing that we've learned several years, as folks conserve, they may actually allocate and so I think to talk about water supply reliability, we do have to focus in on for how long, we have to be more specific about what we need.
I guess the short definition for me would be the availability of the supply when it's needed most. So to me, that's in a nutshell, that's reliability. That's this interplay I was talking about as far as the overall yield, average annual increase versus is the water available in those driest years of shortage. The extent that you can reduce those shortages to years, that's enough.
Okay, so those are good answers, and they sort of water I've tried to think about it, but then it makes me wonder whether or not this is a good way of talking about water supply from an ordinary person's perspective. My guess is that most people think of reliable means constant and guaranteed. So I wonder if it would be better to have a different phrase to describe what it is we're trying to accomplish. Would that help?
Yeah, I mean that's we test that in but I agree with you. I think water supply reliability, internal, long-term, people possibly, and mostly it is personal. My reliability, not his reliability. And so, one of the tasks that the water supply has is to try to balance the needs for urban the economy. And so it becomes almost meaningless to say reliable water.
guess if, is this smart?
In that context, I'm wondering what percentage of water use is currently metered and monitored in California? You mentioned that, identify your most significant water target them. That suggests you have some way of assessing it. Joe, you showed us that graph of how water use went down with the price it higher. So I also heard talk about how we can't meter everything. So what is the level of?
On the urban side, it's almost universal. There are some areas, Sacramento being one of those areas, that has not yet completed metering everything, but most of the state has done that, and all of the state has a mandate to have that done in the next few years. So I think metering in that arena is pretty much, you can assume that if it's not there, it will be in the next few years. On the agricultural side, there are less been controversial, and I'm not sure what the status of that is. I think it ran.
There is more metering, but I guess I question whether or not meters, even in individual houses in 2050 or century is where we're going to be going. What I am seeing in some areas is signals that will gather information. You don't have to necessarily have, you have to have device in each home that would help to send the signal, but the gathering of the signals would come in the area that's happening in Burbank. And so it's cheaper. Targeted metering, I was fighting for difficult situations, huge thing that is happening. Certainly in terms of agriculture, increasingly being able to satellites and being used to gather information about how water is being I just think there's not metering per se that is counting water that is heading in a good direction, but we'll see.
I have a particular experience with this because we worked on use of irrigation water in British Columbia, and we have a particularly primitive system. Basically, the regional engineers need water and write licenses, and for agriculture in the driest areas, they're basically authorized to use an acre foot a year for irrigation. But once the license is written, nobody goes to look and see how much they actually use. We found that up to 10 of the licenses active. So there was a huge opportunity to streamline better. It hasn't improved over the time, but I'm just wondering if there are similar issues.
I would like to endorse what Fran said, because of course 80% of water is used in agriculture.
Same in BC.
And metering is not the standard case. However, the new technologies coming through with remote sensing from satellites and drones, remarkable. We evapotranspiration. They have economies of scale, can be done really cheaply, have constant errors, so the errors are the same for everybody, and they are rapidly improving in terms of software. This is now standard practice in Idaho, where the entire state is measured in oil efficiency, even being used to solve court cases. So I think California should move rapidly to that and have a centralized system so that we know who is using what. And don't tell them to use it, but know what's going on.
The clarification question here. Joe said something about trends in urban water use, which we know quite a lot about and have for some time. But there's a lot of contradictory discussion about trends in water use in agriculture, all the way from we're conserving as much as we can because this is the big knob that we could turn. Is there enough data to understand those trends? Are they the same as the ones you talked about, Joe? Or Richard, anybody?
Well, I have an opinion on that. And I think the potential for real conservation in agriculture is quite limited. Because for most of the agricultural regions of this state, that water which goes down deep percolation is usually some that goes in surface runoff, is used usually by recharge. So if you look at the basin efficiency of the you get very different measures. Having said that, I think it's really important to know where water is being used, and actually essential to know this if we're going to implement the new groundwater legislation in an equitable way. Because if somebody is over pumping, they are essentially taking somebody else's water.
Well, and I would say if you're going to have a market,
Yeah.
you have to have, you have to know what's out there.
The technology is there, and I will take you a copy of a study on 5 Delta Islands.
Could I just ask a clarifying question on that? Because talking about water use, but really it's getting some paper that came a few days last year that appeared in the online journal really highlighted the difficulty.
I agree with that. I wanted to say that while I think agricultural water use efficiency is improving, I think it differs widely. If you're in a district where you only pay $10 an acre foot, then the incentives to do water conservation are much, much less than if you're in wetlands or you're someplace where water is extremely valuable and you treat it much more as a commodity and a huge input into your business. There are a few places in the state where the cost of water is still so low that the water use efficiency is not high priority. I do agree that long term, most of that water ends up being recaptured, reused someplace else. So it's not as if it's all flowing out to the ocean if it's not properly.
And again, I would say just to answer to your question, it's strategic placement of meters or outlet the house. Can be done. You don't have to be.
Maybe we can take a few more questions on this topic.
I'm going to change directions a little bit, and I'm going to link it to a little bit of what I've heard from the 5 of you, and also a little bit to what I've been doing since I left the position as the lead scientist. And that is, we talked about Australia. We talked about some of the very variable climate that California has and the precipitation regimes, changing precipitation regimes. Well, the one thing I've been doing is kind of preface this. I've been involved with an international group that's been looking at temporary or intermittent waterways around the world. So in Australia, 70% of the rivers of Australia are intermittent or temporary. I suspect in the western United States, 50% or more are temporary or intermittent. Even in France, where one of our scientists is engaged in this, there's 30 to 40% of the rivers of France are intermittent. So the question I'd like to pose to all of you is, what do you do relative to basically either regulatory or ecologically, or in terms of working with the fact that a large part of California is not perennial flow systems, they're intermittent flow systems, yet they are often produce flood damage. They can also be a possible source of water supply. And as you look closely, you actually find out they're also loci of biodiversity. So I'm just curious whether this is on the radar screen of people in California, and whether it's getting attention.
Okay. I'm sorry I'm talking so much. Clearly, I agree. The majority of our watersheds. I think the answer is you have to manage them one at a time. You have to think about those issues. We're looking at those. In our region, we have streams that have no flow in them much of the time, but then do get flows when it's wet. And in wet years may have flows for 12 months or 24 months in a row. So we have those things, and we have to look at exactly what you said. You have to look at, okay, what's the potential flood damage, and you have to figure that out, and you have to look at the environment, and you look at the species are there, and you have to look at, well, can we recharge, can we capture some of this water when we do get the water? And there is no simple answer. It's just something you have to work with, and people have been doing it a long time, but it's not simple, easy, and cheap. It's something.
And they're major sources of recharge in much of the Western United States.
They are, in fact, major sources of recharge, the main sources of recharge.
There is some funding this year in the governor's budget for working on flow this. And how cost-effective it is. Water board and on a few of them, I don't think there is section. Raising calls out for greater regional planning when and where there is water, so that whoever happens to be the lucky fellow that has water
This is an obvious observation. Challenging. It strikes me that this is also an area where
Australia getting groundwater with water interaction component right is very important. They had permanence versus spatial intermittence versus.
And I'm going to put this microscope right here. So I think John said that when he was looking at regulatory issues affecting water supply reliability, that mostly the older regulations were prescriptive, and the newer ones demanded more real-time responses. And one of the things that we've been talking about as a group is how is the California Delta system different than other big systems that are being managed, and what are the different policy implications and issues that make it more challenging. You all have a lot of experience in a bunch of different systems. So is California really different in that way, that there's more kind of real-time response, so it's much more difficult to forecast and to plan because you don't know what's going to happen to particular populations of fish that you then have to add water to the system for? You can't account for that, so you have to store more water. And what's the cost of that as kind of a regulatory system, having this kind of immediate real-time feedback versus planning a year out, 6 months out? Or is that even a reasonable question?
Well, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of experience with other systems. So this is the one I know the best. And I guess what I can say is one of the major importances of the kind of this real-time response is the reliance on the unregulated flows that are in the system. And as I had indicated earlier, so for example, the only other system I can think of is the Colorado system, which is highly regulated, high degree of dam versus the total runoff of that system, whereas there's just a very much smaller percent of the Sacramento system that is regulated in comparison to its annual runoff. And so even though we do regulate with the major dams above the rim dams for the watersheds up in the Sierra Nevada, the part of the system that is to a large degree unregulated is the precipitation that occurs downstream of the dams. And this is a piece that this is just a piece of the system that we struggle with. And the only way to regulate any of that system is essentially through the exports. And so to the degree that's very limited, because the types of flows that enter the delta, even if let's say we've got minimum releases from those upstream dams, there can be a substantial amount of runoff that occurs downstream of those dams. And to the extent that the one tool that we have available to us at the exports is restricted because of this conflict with the fishery protection, then that's the one last tool that was available to us for that type of management system. Trying to remember your question, but yeah, I don't know about the other systems, but I do know that this kind of flexibility as it relates to implementation of the standard, like I said, is a double-edged sword. So it's to the extent that we can be flexible and when fishery are out of harm's way and be able to export that water when it's available, the unregulated water when it's available. That's the good part. That's the positive side. The negative side is it just introduces another area of uncertainty as far as our management capabilities on how much water is going to be available through the year, not knowing how much water we'll be able to pump on any given day or week ahead of time.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left.
I have one question that's, I probably know the answer to, but I spent a little time in Africa, and I know across the world people are talking about water pricing and things like that, but what we know at where the poverty-stricken part of the community is very large is that pricing water equals cholera. And I would ask, in other words, when people who can't afford to pay at all for water end up using water in their backyard and using it in ways that are not safe. Do we have an equity problem in using the market to run this system, or is there a way to deal with that? Is that part of all these plans?
Well, I'll have a go at that, and of course you're absolutely right in some places where they've gone down the laissez-faire market, because however, in many other places the essential factor is that there's a basic minimum requirement, which is a basic human right to clean water of a certain quantity. And it's necessary, what you should be doing is structuring the rates accordingly to provide that preferably free. And usually the proportion of the population that is so destitute as to need that is relatively small. Of course, where it's large, perhaps it's an impractical idea. But the irony is that certainly in Africa, the poor are really always paying the most for their water because they're getting it from tanker trucks and so on, where they don't have reliable, clean hookups for their houses.
The way, at least in the urban sector, I don't know the agricultural sector as well, the way the urban sector has handled it in general, somewhat the way the electricity sector has handled it. They've had a lifeline rate that where so that they can collect the money from everyone and more from some, and then can offer a lifeline rate. That is under challenge right now in the courts. So we should hear fairly soon as to what the outcome of that will be. I guess if that's not allowed, then we'll have to figure out another way. But I think the basic, never will we move to a just total free market situation where the poor would be expected to pay the market rate. I can't see California going in that direction. And in fact, we have been in that direction in some areas, and we're moving, I think, more to a more humane approach where people there's a lot of money in the bond this year.
All right. The presenter today, thanks for coming. Do any of you have any final messages for the panel before we leave?
Good luck and good night, right?
But again, just all the presenters, we know this is a very difficult time, so thanks so much for coming in and talking. And we will reconvene at 1 o'clock. It's a very full afternoon, so 1 o'clock, please.